Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
But thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is a flagship event of Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is connecting Nepal to the world by bringing leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policy makers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy and to achieve its national goal. This is session N of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Amit Gupta here with us. Dr. Amit Gupta is an associate professor at the USAF Air War College, Alabama. His writings have focused on arms production and weapons proliferation, South Asian and Australian security policies, diaspora politics, popular culture and politics, and more recently on the US-China rivalry and the impact of demography on US foreign policy. He has authored and edited several books and articles. Without any further ado, I request the chair to take over.
Okay, thank you, Paki. So far, Sumit is a no-show right now, but he may sign in given all the technical problems we seem to be having nowadays. Oh, there's Sumit. Nice to see you, Sumit. Unmute your mic, please.
So I'll just send you a request.
Ask to unmute.
Ah, wonderful. Okay. So we'll just go down, today's panel is on the future of American world order. We'll just go down the list of participants the way they've been listed. And in the end, I'll probably talk for 3 or 4 minutes. Our first speaker today is Professor Sumit Ganguly, who is a distinguished Rabindranath Tagore professor at Indiana University in Bloomington. Not my favorite university because they've been rivals for years. And I would easily say one of the 3, oh, come on, it's called Bobby Knight. Now, he's also one of the 3 leading South Asia experts in the country, along with Ashley Tellis and Carol Christine Fair. So without further ado, Sumit, please go ahead. Maybe 8 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks very much for that generous and kind introduction, despite the snide remark about my university basketball team. Bobby Knight has long gone, by the way. And since then, our fortunes have also declined. The future of the American-led global order. I will argue that it depends in large measure on three key pivots and three imponderables. Let me talk about the three pivots first. The first, of course, is that the future, it depends in large measure on the future course of American foreign policy. We have seen a re-engagement with the world under President Biden from this year onwards. On the other hand, we don't know who is going to be president in 2024. It's unclear that Biden is going to run, given his age. It's not clear what Democratic contenders there will be, and it's not clear what Republican frontrunner might emerge. If we have a Republican president in the mold of Donald Trump, one could again see a kind of disengagement with the world, which would have important consequences for the American-led global order, because Trump in many ways upset the apple cart in very significant ways. So that's the first pivot. The second is the continuing challenge of the PRC under Xi Jinping. And that challenge, I suspect, as long as Xi Jinping is at the helm and in decent health, will continue. And that will be an important challenge to the American-led global order, because Xi and his counterpart in Russia, Vladimir Putin, have a very different vision of world order. And they will continue to pose a significant challenge to the American-led global order. Third, I would argue that it also depends on how the EU, Japan, and others behave in the foreseeable future. In considerable part, it will depend on whether or not the EU remains firmly aligned with the United States, despite the kind of maltreatment that it endured under Trump. Japan did not face similar opprobrium under Trump, but nevertheless saw a bit of a rift in US-Japan relations. And much will depend on how these two entities can behave and respond to American initiatives. Let me now talk about three imponderables. The first is the possibilities of global economic recovery in the post-COVID-19 era. This remains quite uncertain because of the highly uneven responses to COVID-19 across the world and highly uneven recovery rates in different parts of the world. The United States, after a shambolic effort under Trump, under Biden has done remarkably well, and close to 45% of the total population at this point has been fully inoculated. The US is also anticipating a possible wave in the future because of the Delta variant, and is already now planning to carry out or planning to produce a booster vaccine, if necessary, this fall. The problem, of course, in the US lies primarily in the southern states, which have been significant laggards in terms of vaccine acceptance. And this remains a continuing problem in the United States. But I shouldn't dwell on the US alone. Any number of OECD countries, not to mention a host of developing countries, face significant challenges, and consequently, the possibilities of economic recovery remain quite fraught in the future. And this will affect the American global order because so much of the American global order has to do with promoting greater economic integration, greater free trade, and the like. And in turn, this leads me to my second imponderable, that the rates of recovery will also affect questions of trade, protectionism, and immigration, all of which are closely linked to the American-led global order. And these remain significant questions and uncertainties because we really don't know how economic recovery will proceed. And then finally, moving away from economics towards the end, much will also depend on a couple of American initiatives in the Middle East. The most important of which, of course, is the attempt to revise and revive the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action with Iran, which remains very much fraught with uncertainty at the moment, especially in light of the Iranian election. Some people are arguing that the hardline emergence of this hardline president in Iran might actually make it easier to reach an accord with the United States because he can protect himself from domestic flanks, from domestic criticism. On the other hand, a hardliner may drive for a very difficult bargain with the United States, which the US may not be able to deliver on. And in considerable part, peace and stability in the Middle East will depend upon the US reaching some kind of an accord or understanding, or at least the beginnings of reconciliation with Iran. And not in an entirely unrelated fashion, we will also have to watch very closely the future of the fragile Israeli coalition, which is composed of the most heterogeneous combination of parties and led by an extraordinary hardliner, Naftali Bennett, who is unalterably opposed to any revival of the JCPOA. And given the extraordinary strong relationship, the alliance that exists between the United States and Israel, the Biden administration will have to proceed with considerable care in terms of dealing with this heterogeneous coalition led by a hardliner in Israel, because that government led by Naftali Bennett could make life quite difficult for the United States in terms of proceeding forthwith with the JCPOA. The one other uncertainty that also exists in the Middle East, of course, is the future of Iraq. At the moment, matters don't seem especially dire, but all we need to see is yet another bombing in a market in Baghdad or another major city, and Iraq is again likely to come to the fore and again distract American attention away from its focus primarily on Iran at the moment. The Biden administration simply would not be able to stand by idly if Iraq again heads towards headlong towards destabilization. And not quite in the Middle East. I think it's really in South Asia, but on the fringes of the Middle East, of course, is the question of Afghanistan. It is more than apparent that Biden has no intentions of resiling from his plans to withdraw from Afghanistan, despite the dire predictions that a number of individuals who have made about the future of Afghanistan in the absence of a significant American military presence. And this again remains a source of considerable uncertainty. So to wrap up very quickly, there are three then key pivots and three major imponderables in terms of the future of the American-led global order. Thanks very much, Amit.
Thank you, Sumit. It's a good way to start the program. By the way, you guys are competing with Guilford John Eikenberry on the other panel. So you've got some tough competition here.
We do have some tough competition.
Real name is Guilford. He goes by the alias G. Our next speaker is Mr. Paul Saunders, who was a special advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, is now with the Center for National Interest. And is it Mr. Sanders or Dr. Sanders? Please forgive me.
It's Mr. and actually it's Saunders.
Well, that's a double apology then, you know, and saying,
no, problem at all. No problem at all. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today. I had planned to talk about some of the factors that I thought would shape the future of the American global order, and it seems that Professor Ganguly and I have actually broadly quite similar perspectives, I have to say, with some differences, but I think broadly quite similar. So rather than going through my points here, which I think overlap broadly conceptually, maybe I'll just react in a few specific areas. I guess the first thing I would observe about the future of the American global order is, and really the biggest factor is what the United States wants, right? And I think, as Professor Ganguly observed, that's still rather uncertain. It's something that can change from election to election. Broadly speaking, however, I think there are two basic approaches to global order. One, which is the kind of dominant perspective in the United States today, and certainly has been for the entire post-Cold War period, is that through some combination of cooperation with our allies and pressure on our rivals, we encourage everyone to acquiesce in the existing order. It's kind of a defense of the existing order to the extent that we can say that such an order exists, which is a more complex question. The second broad approach, which a number of Americans have proposed, but which really has very little support at this time, is to look toward a more consensus-based approach to international order that includes America's rivals and requires some negotiation with our rivals to get us there. And I think the greatest obstacles really to the United States taking that approach, I would say first and foremost, the very limited trust that US elites would place in the leaders in our two principal rivals, China and Russia. And related to that, the fear in the United States that any understandings that would be reached in order to try to create some kind of consensus-based order would very promptly be violated by the other parties, right? So I thought it was important just to take a step back in making that comment, because I think there is this very broad question of approach. Clearly, we don't know whether Mr. Biden will run again and win. We don't know if he doesn't run again, who else might win. My sense of the American political system today is that if we have a Republican successor to President Biden, I think that individual is less likely to be kind of interested in disengaging from the rest of the world, and more likely to be in the Republican school that leans toward what I would call assertive unilateralism. And Trump certainly had some of those tendencies himself. his national security advisor for a period of time, John Bolton, I think very much represents that school of thought, that there are a number of potential Republican candidates who come from that direction. Another, I think, really profound question, and Professor Ganguly also touched on this, but I'm going to frame it in a slightly different way, is the capacity of the American political system and the systems of its principal rivals to kind of organize themselves to address their own domestic challenges, to develop and implement effective strategies for their rivalry with one another. And the United States and our American political system, you know, it has a variety of shortcomings and challenges. I think those are visible to everyone. I think I would point out perhaps a couple of things on that point. One is that the challenges that our rivals face are often much less visible because they make a deliberate effort to conceal them from their own societies and from else. It makes it somewhat more challenging analytically to determine how sustainable those systems and their approaches are over time. So I think that's one key question. I think the second thing that I would point to is that notwithstanding the very considerable political polarization in the United States, which is a real obstacle to much of the governance that many Americans would like to see. I do think that the competition, and particularly the competition with China, is starting to impose greater discipline on the Congress. And I think we will see more of that. And I think that the Biden administration certainly is thinking in a much more coherent, systematic, and strategic manner about how to approach these rivalries than the Trump administration did. And I think that the Trump administration was really an outlier in that respect, in no small part because former President Trump was really a political outsider with just very limited experience in government or with policy issues. And I think it's unlikely we'll have another leader like that in the near future. In any event, I do, as I said, agree kind of broadly with the criteria that have already been set out, or perhaps we should call them the factors that have already been set out in thinking about how the U.S. led world order will evolve or alternatively erode. So why don't I stop there and let's continue onward.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, right on time. Our next speaker is Professor Toshi Nakayama. Toshi, there you are. Professor Nakayama is at Keio University, but he has a distinguished career. He was in the Japanese mission at the United Nations. He's also a member of the Japanese Institute of International Affairs. So he's one of those people who's both a practitioner and an academic. So Toshi-san, floor is yours. Please unmute your mic.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I'd like to focus on sort of how future of American world order is seen from Northeast Asia, specifically from a Japanese perspective. Clearly, the world that we're living in is not the post-Cold War era, and also the 2000s, right, when we were facing sort of terrorist threats and sort of non-state actors. That era is also over, and also for the past several decades, or maybe even going back to the early 20th century, I think what was happening in the sort of the transatlantic realm was the defining issue of sort of world politics. But these days, I think more and more what's going on in the Pacific sphere and the Indo-Pacific space is becoming more and more important. I think that there isn't much debate about that. And how America is willing to face the issues that's going on in that region as a Pacific nation. More specifically, how America would sort of face the China challenge would shape, in a significant way, the kind of world order that we're going to see. And also, in addition to these, geographical spheres, we're seeing, cyberspace and sort of the space, outer space. The new domains are sort of that we're facing. Also, in that sphere, the competition between and sometimes may lead into confrontation between China and US would be the defining factor. And for Japan and for Japan's sort of national security policy, sort of America, how sort of, or sort of the fact that America would remain a resident power in Asia Pacific and retain strong interest in the issues sort of that's happening in Indo-Pacific would be quite significant. And Japan's sort of national security policy is premised on this sort of US being a resident power and having interest in the issues that's occurring in the Indo-Pacific. So precisely because of that, Japan does not have the luxury of sort of, observing objectively where America is and what kind of a world order that we're going to face. We see our mission as trying to sort of convince the Americans that you've been a resident power in this region, not geographically, but functionally. And we see it as our role, trying to convince the Americans to keep on sort of pursuing that role. But there have been some major concerns in Japan about sort of, the state of American internationalism. It didn't just start out with Mr. Trump. I think it started during the Obama era. Although, the content of or the worries, the kind of worries that we had about the two administrations were totally different. We sort of catched a signal that the both administration, in a very different way, was sort of reluctant in accepting this, liberal international order upholding business. And I think this is quite well known around the world, but sort of the Japanese reaction to both, administration was that if you compare, Trump's foreign policy and Obama's foreign policy, there was a sense in Japan that maybe Trump's foreign policy might be better, right? And this is not sort of, that was not the popular view in the global community. I do understand that. But if you look at Japan specifically, precisely because Mr. Trump was tougher on China, that not that we supported his, his view about the world and how sort of America engaged during the Trump era, not that we supported it, but we thought it was better than the sort of the G2 based notion of U.S.-China policy, than Mr. Trump's sort of a tougher position on China. From a Japanese perspective, I think there was some achievement in Trump's foreign policy in that this notion of peaceful coexistence with China is no longer sustainable, and that we were entering the era of great power competition. Yes, probably if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, she would definitely have been tougher on China than Obama. But then again, I think there's some doubt whether she could have sort of defined the era as a great power competition. Right? I think she still sort of would have clung to this notion of peaceful coexistence. So from a Japanese perspective, the fact that Trump team recognized this challenge from China was an achievement. But was the Trump foreign policy smart in sort of dealing competition from China, challenge from China? Were they able to sort of establish a sustainable sort of competitive policy toward China? I think they were far from that. But if you think of U.S.-China policy as like a huge ship, right? Maybe we needed a Trump shock to change the course of that a huge ship. So Mr. Biden's China policy, there's a continuation between Mr. Trump's and Mr. Biden's in the toughness, but of course it's quite different in that Mr. Biden's China policy is not just about sort of confronting China, but more about sort of surrounding China with a desirable order, rules, and norms with allies, partners, and coalition partners. So clearly the scope is very different, and it's much more smart and it's sophisticated. But the fact that the policy is smart and sophisticated makes, and precisely because of that, it makes the execution of the policy extremely difficult. So I think the focal point since Mr. Biden took office in January in his foreign policy was to convince the world that America is back, right? And when he was in Europe, 10 days ago, I don't know how many times he repeated, America is back. And that kind of shows that, he understands the difficulty of convincing the world that America is back. So the question is, are the world convinced about, Mr. Biden's message? Is America back? We don't know, but so much depends on what's happening domestically, I would say. And it was touched upon by the two previous speakers. In terms of, the basis of international sort of action, American internationalism, there is no consensus that we saw during, World War II, the Great Generation, no consensus sort of resembling the early Cold War period before the Vietnam War, and no consensus right after September 11th. We see none of that. Toughness on China, yes, sort of, but not an agreement and consensus about what kind of role America should accept abroad. And the partisan divide is so deep, and it's penetrating foreign policy, national security policy as well. This notion, foreign policy stops at water's edge, which was cited by Senator Vanderberg, no longer sort of exists. So there are worries, but for the time being, I guess for Japan, from a Japanese perspective, in order to strengthen the kind of order that we prefer, I think there's no other options to stick with the US. So as I said at the outset, we see our missions as trying to convince the US that US has to be a resident power, and also convince the American people as well that this is not your effort alone, right? Liberal international order during the Cold War days was a unilateral American effort. Yes, there were help from allies, but it was a sort of a unilateral globalism. Americans respected the responsibility. But now, that notion is bleak. Right? So I guess we have to tell the Americans, it's not your efforts alone. We would participate. We would do our own, we would take our own responsibility and become forward leading. So I think that's the attitude that you see from Japan. And there's talk about, rising nationalism in Japan when Japan tries to accept a forward-leaning role in security. But I don't think it's about that. It's about upholding liberal international order together with the US, together with Australians and other partners. And if we actually succeed in doing this, I think we can make the kind of order that we cherish more sort of credible, more sustainable, and even stronger. Not just an American effort, but America at the center, but many of the other players are playing an important role as well. So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toshi-san. And you hit the nail on the head. A nuanced and sophisticated policy is very difficult to implement. So fingers crossed on that. Our next speaker is Dr. Namrata Goswami. And I had to look you up on Amazon, Dr. Goswami, and I'm quite impressed. She started her career working on just war theory. She now works on space policy, which in one sense is a different kind of just war. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, and thank you, NICE, for having me in this excellent conclave. So in the 8 minutes I have, I'm going to talk about 10 points that I think defines the future of American world order. So first of all, American order is a world where America's power and influence, it's a hope that it'll enable it to secure its preferences for a rules-based international society, by which I mean where classical liberal ideas and societies continue to flourish politically and economically, against the challenge of closed economic and autocratic blocs or empires. So in the time that we have the American world order since 1945, you can see that there are certain patterns. One is, of course, as I mentioned, the rise of liberal institutionalism, the rise of a free trading system, the increase in democracy and democratic states as a norm. And so that is something that is the basis from where we can then contemplate and prospect about what a future of American world order would look like. Now, American world order, as you can see, is inclusive in terms of rule-following states. And also what is interesting from my perspective is that it is basically an order that supports territorial status quo and which seeks and aspires to distribute wins broadly and fairly. Now, as a status quo power, if you see how American foreign policy behaves, especially military policy, it is strategically defensive. Now, the third point that I have is that there are always these conversations that there is a decline of America, and predicting decline is, of course, a recurring hobby. But I would say that if you look at the history of America, for example, its emergence from the Civil War, the riots and assassinations of the 1960s, to the Cold War and its competition with the Soviet Union, the Japanese challenge in the 1980s, and today, as Professor Ganguly and several other panelists have pointed out, the China challenge, America has seemingly risen to that particular systemic challenge. Now, one of the contention on the basis of which I make this argument is that for China, despite the fact that it's a challenge, and I'll mention that later, you can see that certain internal challenges are also there for China. One is, of course, its demographic trend. Will it be caught in a middle income trap? There are many debts that it has to pay for. And also, will there be fragmentation of China itself, which has been a conversation for a long time? Now, based on that point, what you can see, as mentioned by Mr. Toshi, and also in terms of what I see, there is an increasing recognition across the bipartisan aisle, despite the polarization we see in American internal politics, that China is literally a systemic challenge. You can see that in President Biden's continuation of competition with China. You can see this particular perspective very much a forefront of the Trump administration's foreign policy. And so what I see in my observation, including in America's engagement across the world, especially the Indo-Pacific, the recent NATO conversations, the G7, there is a recognition that China has become a systemic challenge. Whether this will be adopted by its allies is something that we'll have to wait and see. The other point I have is that if you look at the future of American world order, I would think that America will continue to oscillate between active international leadership and self-distraction. For example, you can see that there would be a tendency to look internally, given the fact that there are challenges that we see in the last few years. But based on that, I think international leadership will be very much propelled at the systemic level by the rise of China. As Professor Ganguly mentioned, the China under President Xi Jinping is a very different China from the China under President Hu Jintao or even under Deng Xiaoping. In the last few years, since President Xi has taken over leadership, you have seen that he has institutionalized the activity of the Communist Party of China. He has offered us his thought on China with socialism, with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And as part of the 8 principles that President Xi has forwarded, one important principle is to establish China as a global leader and a country that actually, in collaboration with other partners, for example, like Russia, establishes an alternate vision of what the future order. President Xi has very clearly articulated that that particular order would be dominated and determined by the leadership role of the Communist Party of China, and which means that he is against representation, democracy, and the freedom of press. So we are dealing with that at the systemic level under President Xi. I think one of the biggest internal threat that could have diverging narratives within America as it shapes the international order, or whether it refuses to do that, is this question about the American political and social identity. In the last few years since I've lived here, what I've noticed is that there is a growing conversation about challenging the founding documents, the values of liberty, rationality, and objectivity, where concepts like subjective analysis has become more important. And so that could actually lead to the subversion of a cohesive strength, which was mentioned by some of the panelists before, that could actually lead to giving up of leadership because of that. And that's a challenge that I think the future of American world order will need to deal with. Now, the other important point in terms of America's world order is that, and because as Dr. Gupta mentioned, I study space, I think America's future order will look to becoming multiplanetary. You can see such conversations coming out in terms of policy documents. Already you see that the United States, as it shapes the future of humanity as we speak, has recognized the critical importance of space, not just as a military domain, but also as a domain for commercial and political activity. And so in that context, what I would see in the future is that America would try to utilize the concepts of free trade, freedom of lines of communication, free societies to the realm of space. You can see such efforts in the Artemis program established by the Trump administration for the moon and the Space Force, and this has been actually supported and continued by President Biden. In fact, President Biden's spokesperson in a recent press conference said that there is one realm where there is great continuity from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, and that is space. So in conclusion, I would say that America is currently considering strategic initiatives to expand its power, especially. But what is critical is that when you think about the future of the American world order, you also think about how is power utilized and how is it shared and distributed. And in a sense, if you look at the past of how America has behaved, despite the challenges as it faces in some quarters, for example, the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, it has always aspired to establish an international system where liberal values are actually distributed, propagated, and democracy, human rights, women's rights, and many other human rights are actually propagated and offered as a normative domain. I would end by saying that America is likely to extend the concept of security community, inclusive of all domains, air, land, sea, and space. And a future American order, because we've not spoken about that as yet, will negotiate a balance in artificial intelligence, social media, which counters subversion and disinformation, but will still favor individual freedom and expression as an alternative to authoritarian control of free societies and freedom of expression. Finally, and this is a point I think which we need to think about when we think of a future of American world order, is that American political cultural influences will continue to be more international as the demographic composition of the United States itself changes, where we see a larger contribution to the economy, to culture, to popular culture coming out from South Asians, East Asians, Africans, and Latin Americans. So I will end there, Dr. Gupta, and thank you for your time, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. I'll talk a little bit about what you just talked about in the conclusion. Our next speaker is Professor Glenn Diesen of the University of Southeast Norway in Vestfold. I am personally very disappointed you're not from Bo or Boo or whatever it's pronounced as. You have to give me the correct pronunciation on that one because it's got the line through the O. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, that's pronounced it's in Bö. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, before I worked there, I worked at the HSC in Moscow. So I primarily wanted to take a Russian perspective on this issue. So yeah, defining first the American world order, but then also second argue why and how it's expected to come to an end. So the American world order, also known as the unipolar order, rested primarily on economic dominance. So within three pillars, that is the leading high-tech industries, it controlled transportation corridors by controlling the seas, and third, controlling the financial instruments, so the reserve currency, banks, payment systems, and such. So much of this dominance was achieved, obviously, by the end of the Second World War across the West, but after the Cold War, was to be extended across the world. Now, what did this mean for the world order and international law? Well, we know that states do not constrain themselves. So when there is a unipolar world order, then there can't really be sovereign equality to the same extent. So this is also reflected in international law. Now, international law, as developed under the UN Charter after the Second World War, was based largely on the principles of mutual constraints and sovereign equality. Now, in a unipolar system, US had great incentives to introduce rules and principles that promoted sovereign inequality. So sovereignty for US and its allies, but not so much for adversaries. So the new ideas that entered was democracy promotion, humanitarian interventionism, the global war on terror. So the common denominator has always been sovereignty for us, but, well, not for you. So these days, the US rarely even refers to international law. Instead, it refers to the so-called rules-based international system. And again, this is not the same as international law, as it implies to a large extent that liberal values exempts the US from the same international law as it does its rivals. So human rights, democracy becomes to some extent hegemonic norms. So for one side to police another instead of having common rules of mutual constraint. So after Cold War, we see therefore that human rights and democracy have become instruments for sovereign inequality. And this is largely where the annoyance comes, especially in Moscow. So allowing the US therefore also to monopolize on security by only endowing its allies with full sovereignty. So for example, yes, Saudi crimes to human rights will be tolerated while Iran will be sanctioned. Similarly, Ukraine can arrest the main opposition leader, shut down media, or send militias to attack its own population. There will be no sanctions on allies. While when it comes to Russia, we have as an adversary of anything from real, exaggerated, or even imagined human rights violations will result in sanctions, which are usually quite openly stated that the intention is eventually regime change, which obviously is not a tolerable system for Moscow. So American world order has therefore been seen to be one of sovereign inequality, one where the US can interfere in domestic affairs of Russia, which is supposedly good for democracy, while if Russia interferes in domestic affairs of the United States, that's bad for democracy. So similarly, it's also not appreciated, obviously, that the US has the prerogative to topple democratically elected governments and calling it democratic revolutions, or invade countries under the auspices of humanitarian interventionism. Also, this is why Kosovo could split from Serbia, but Crimea is not allowed to split from Ukraine. So it's not consistent principles in terms of human rights being the independent variable, rather it's seen to be an instrument. So again, a hegemonic norm. Again, for argument's sake, we can argue that the US is genuine in the belief that it's trying to serve liberal values, but nonetheless, for countries like Russia, but also China, it's a very much an unacceptable way of organizing international relations. So, in terms of the future of this order, I would say that first it's important to see that the power structures are very much changing. First, China's rising, and since 2014, with the Western-backed coup in Ukraine, Russia has abandoned its greater Europe ambition since Gorbachev's era, but also a 300-year-long Western-centric foreign policy since Peter the Great, and it's now pivoting to the east and essentially replaced this greater Europe initiative with greater Eurasia. So this entails, necessitates a strategic partnership with countries, primarily China, but also others. And the objective is then to work towards decoupling from US geoeconomic architecture in what's becoming known as this Greater Eurasian Partnership. And this means they're developing new high-tech industries with their own supply chains, decoupled from the US, to assert leadership in the new industrial revolutions. They're spending trillions of dollars on transportation corridors, primarily China through the Belt and Road initiatives. But Russia also has its own formats, and they're also setting up new development banks, new payment systems, and also working towards de-dollarizing their economies. So as the US loses its position as the dominant economic power, I would expect, or at least Moscow increasingly expects, that the American world order unavoidably will change. This means that the era of sovereign inequality or rules-based international system is rejected and demands instead that international law, according to the UN, comes back. And in Europe, that we actually have the Helsinki Accords, with the first principle being sovereign equality, that this has to be returned. Now, this was obviously evident with the Chinese-American meeting in Alaska, but also the Biden-Putin summit as well, the idea that neither side will anymore be lectured by the United States. So similarly, both Russia and China will seek to reduce US interference into its domestic affairs, and if it doesn't, it will reciprocate. And also it will more actively, which it already started to do, use counter sanctions now that it's less vulnerable to the US sanctions and has more autonomy. So this is relatively new, because until recently, when Moscow still wanted to join the West, it would often make excuses for human rights violations. Now it simply won't play this game at all and simply rejects. So either there's sovereign equality or just scrap it entirely from the international security discourse. Furthermore, I think Russia will be more and more willing to oppose so-called the liberal wars, so regime change wars. So from what was done in Serbia, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, that it will increasingly, as we see in Syria now, be opposed and balanced. And so lastly, as the previous speaker also touched upon, what will replace or what will follow or happen with the American world order, it's been expected, at least from Moscow, that the US is faced with a choice or a dilemma. So the US can either facilitate a transition towards a multipolar system defined by sovereign equality, where the US could enjoy a leadership position, so be the first among equal if you want. Or second, the US could resist the emergence of a multipolar system based on sovereign equality, but then it would see a multipolar system develop in opposition to the United States. So China, Russia, Iran, to a large extent defining their cooperation as an effort to marginalize the position of the United States. So it appears that the US has gone towards the second option, which means attempting to extend the format of the American world order and thus seeing its principal rivals cooperate in opposition to the United States. While we also see that US allies, such as the Europeans, are becoming more reluctant to stand behind the United States, so calling more and more for an independent foreign policy. Try to get along with Russia, but also not joining this Cold War against the Chinese. And this suggests that the American world order would be in decline, while also becoming to some extent more reliant on coercing allies to display geoeconomic loyalties. So for example, preventing them from buying Chinese technologies or preventing them from buying Russian gas. So all this is taking now place without real clear international rules and order, as we're stuck between the UN Charter and this new rules-based order. And just to conclude, I would say that Russia's now very much betting on that the foundations of what can be referred to the American world order is coming to an end, and instead putting its full weight behind this new Greater Eurasian Partnership, which it hopes will be able to balance what's seen as effectively been 3 decades of American unilateralism. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Diesen, and eminently qualified to talk on this because he has 8 solo books or edited books on the subject. And I just will say one thing: every American president knows multipolarity is coming. No American president can say that to the American public and get away with it. That's the dilemma. All right, our next and last speaker is my friend Ariel Gonzalez Levaggi of the Pontifical University of Buenos Aires. He just had an article accepted in the Journal of International Affairs, which is very impressive. But he does have very unsound views on Diego Armando Maradona. I am working to convert him to make him understand the true beauty of that genius. Ariel, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Amit. It has been a very interesting discussion, and I will provide a Latin American perspective, trying to think about the future of the American world. So I have 2 basic questions. Are we still American world order? What are the Latin American perspective on that? So we are going through a transition, and although it still is not painful as the story of the rise and fall of hegemons teaches, there is almost a consensus that the American world order, understood as a unipolar world, is over. But the milestones of the American lead post-Second World War order remains. However, there is an increasing pressure from alternative visions of world orders, which advance its own norms and institutions with both reformist and revisionist approaches, as Professor Diesen told us about the Chinese and Russian visions. In this context, an Latin American perspective is needed to understand a fully approach toward the American world order. Basically, I will focus on 3 issues: the perceptions in Latin America, the reactions, and the results, or the actual outcomes. About the perceptions, there is an actual dichotomy in which there are part of the academia, decision maker practitioners, that perceives a kind of erosion of the US global and even regional hegemony, versus those who still perceive that the US have the upper hand in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, as the regional hegemon. At the same time, there is an increasing discussion about what is the world that we are living through. Part of the people and experts thinks that we are going through a kind of Cold War like a war, like kind of in which a rising bipolar structure is affecting the Latin American foreign options. But there are others that perceives that the world is more than US and China, and sees countries like India, like Russia, like of course the European Union as alternative partners to develop its strategies. At the same time, it looks at the regional partners, like especially the big countries of the region, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, as partners that they can invest, for example, developing trade and boosting regional integration. But despite this dichotomy in which the US is not seen as the only player in town, there is also kind of dichotomy in normative terms, in which there are most of the countries that are very committed to multilateralism, and actually perceives the actual Biden administration with very positive views, versus countries that, like, for example, Venezuela or Brazil. Venezuela in a very left position, and Brazil in a more rightist one with Bolsonaro, in which the multilateralism is not something that should be promoted, and I have more like unilateral approaches or national interest based. And this is something that creates a lot of uncertainty in the region. So what we saw nowadays in Latin America, and it's very clear in the narrative of the different countries, that there are kind of diversity of visions towards the world order. But there are actually two main reactions to that approach. A first reaction is the promotion of, and this is very similar to maybe an Indian approach, non-active alignment, kind of equidistance among great powers. Basically, equidistance in the dispute between China and the United States. So and in that regard, especially, this is an approach that is promoted by Mexico, by Argentina nowadays, that the countries of the region need to navigate these turbulent waters, trying to improve their international agency by developing like regional partnerships, and trying to benefit from this strategic competence without taking too much commitment, especially in strategic affairs. But the second approach that is, I think, the most popular is about diversification, in which the countries try to overcome this bipolar competence by developing networks and partnership with traditional like blocks, for example, the European Union, or non-traditional, for example, the ASEAN. And in that regard, this is a very that's an interesting approach that is actually in the middle of the discussion throughout the region. There are maybe a third but minoritarian reaction, in which the countries align automatically with the United States. This is something that is losing ground. For example, Bolsonaro, Brazil, developed this kind of foreign policy approach during the Trump's administration, but nowadays he has been forced to change, and actually even the relation with the United States is changing the tone on the issues of Asia, for example, including climate change affairs. So in that regard, the results of this reaction hasn't been so effective, even if we are going through this pandemic, and that affects, of course, the freedom of action of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the regional diplomacies. There is, I think, two main elements that we should underline. First is that the region lacks of regional agency and lacks of a unitarian approach toward world affairs. So Latin America is not a bloc, it has not an uniform approach toward external affairs in the last years. Maybe 10 years ago, the situation was different, especially in South America, with the creation of the Union of South American Nations, the development of the South American Defense Council. But these very interesting initiatives that try to converge different approaches now are actually dead. Even the countries decide to eliminate these initiatives. So Latin America has no one voice. The second element that this is very interesting, that there is an increasing number of pro-Chinese businessmen, scholars, practitioners, and this is something that maybe we saw in the past with Europeans, with the US, with the pro-US or pro-European Union elites were very, very powerful, still are powerful, but nowadays the Chinese are investing a lot in soft power and in business, in finance. So there is a rising pro-Chinese elite in Latin America, and this is something that we will see growing through in the next decade. So this is something that is coming up. So in sum, the Latin American perspective is not uniform, but recognize that the American world order is not only American. This is more diverse and actually allows to have more freedom to engage with other partners, China or even others like European Union, Russia, India, etc. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you, Ariel. Yes, great. I'm just going to say something for about 4 or 5 minutes, because I think, you've all looked at the external dimensions of American world order. I want to just talk about, and Namrata mentioned it in passing, the domestic aspect of a future American world order. And I'll just preface it by saying one thing. America won the Cold War not by militarization, but because it gave a different economic vision and a societal vision that was enticing to the rest of the world. And what I have here is just 3 quick slides which sum this up very simply. And why can I not get it up? There. There we go. All right, look, 3 things that you have to look at when you look at the United States. Firstly, the United States is browning, and by 2044, 50.4% of Americans will be non-white or non-Caucasian. And just to give you an idea, this was by 2022, 50% of American school children were supposed to be non-white. That happened in 2019. So it's happening a lot quicker than what demographers thought would happen. Second thing is, you have to look at different racial groups in America. The largest cohort of white people in America is in the age group 58 to 59. The largest cohort of Hispanics in America is in the age group 12 to 13. We're not just going to brown. This is the problem. You know, when Trump was talking about Mexicans as murderers and rapists, they're the people who are going to be looking after his group in old age homes. And as I always like to say, payback's a bitch. You know? The second thing, which I think is important in this, and let me slide show it and that'll make it easier. Yeah. The second thing which is important is you have to look at the nature of the American economy. It's not a manufacturing economy. It's a high-tech services economy. And if you look at these 5 sectors, all of them have the same issue. They're high reward, they're low employment. Apple only uses 1,300 engineers with its iPhones and all its other devices. Everybody else who works for Apple are those kids who work in the Apple stores. This is the reality of modern America. And what it's led to is this. Last elections, Biden won 477 counties, Trump won 2,497 counties. Biden got 81 million votes, Trump got 74 million votes. Biden got 70% of GDP, Trump got 29 point something percent of GDP. And I guess the Green Party got the rest. If you look at that, that should tell you where the United States is headed. It's going to be a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. It's going to bring in all kinds of influences as a result of that. And, you know, Biden keeps talking about that when he talks about, have you seen how many interracial couples you see on television now? But the fundamental issue is, unless you address inequality, especially income inequality in the United States, in the long term, you can't talk about an American world order, because that world order will be based on a very hollow foundation. And that is why you're seeing all this talk about a middle-class foreign policy, so on. All right, thank you. I thought all the papers were really good. They brought up different aspects. We have 2 questions. One came as a comment, but I've made it into a question. And that is essentially from Mohammed Vikaruddin, who asks, what are universities and think tanks doing about shaping a future American world order? What sort of input do they have? So Paul, Sumit, Namrata, you can all address this. And Toshi-san, you can bring up the, you know, how the Japanese feel when they talk to American think tanks, and do they get any sense that their ideas are being conveyed effectively? All right, please go ahead.
Well, I'm happy to talk about that as someone who has worked for decades at American think tanks. I think that think tanks are, I think, Professor Gupta, you were very right, I think, in stating that, you know, our political class understands well that the world is increasingly a multipolar world. It's not an American unilateral world, and that we can't sustain some kind of American world order on our own. I think that's quite well understood. I think you're also quite correct that it's not something that American presidential candidates, or for that matter, Senate or House of Representatives candidates can publicly say. It is something that some people at think tanks say. I don't think think tanks are yet doing a sufficiently good job in explaining that reality to the American people. And in our defense in think tanks, you know, it's not easy to do something like that when the political class and most of the media isn't really there yet. So it's an uphill struggle, I think, for people in think tanks. But to my mind, this is one of the most important things that we have to do, is to explain to the American people how the world is changing.
Well, I can follow if Professor Ganguly.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I think that's all right, Dr. Gupta. So I think there are three ways in which I see how think tanks, especially American think tanks, shape the future of America's role in the world. I worked at the US Institute of Peace for nearly a year. And what I observe in DC, especially because the think tanks in DC tend to have a big influence in terms of how the White House or the Congress or the Pentagon thinks. And so the first is, I would say that the think tanks still see the world from a very systemic conception of world order. So it's about great power competition. Within great power competition, there is the conceptual notion of multipolarity that comes in. And so it's still a world where there are alignments based on particular ideologies that the think tanks are actually forwarding. The second qualifying point I would make is that it also depends on the agenda setting of that particular think tank based on the funding they get. So for example, if you have a think tank that wants to forward non-proliferation or disarmament, you'll have a tendency to basically talk about that perspective to the extent that sometimes the countervailing perspective is not included. And that's the second point. The third point is that I think if you see what's happening today, and this is a very interesting change that I've seen in the last few years, is that you have the growth of think tanks also based on political leanings. For example, you have think tanks that are supported by Democrats or think tanks supported by Republicans. And what has changed, and which is historical, of course, is that their ability to elevate the conversation beyond just DC to across. For example, I had conversations with a friend of mine just a week ago in Montgomery, Alabama, about the influence of how think tanks away from DC can influence policy as well. An example that was provided was the Institute of Foreign Policy, for example, at the University of Pennsylvania, that actually crafts the ranking of think tanks. And so, which is interesting because we all go to those rankings globally, including the institute I work with in India. So there is a shaping of the world, but it also depends on first the ideological commitment, the systemic way of looking at the world, and finally, and the most important criteria would be funding. So where does your funding come from? So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Sumit, please. You need to unmute, Sumit. You need to unmute your mic.
Right. Sorry, my apologies. I didn't realize I was muted. Let me speak from the standpoint of universities, since I've spent the bulk of my life, my professional life, in universities in the United States and nowhere else. I think there's an extraordinary diversity of views depending upon the political science and international affairs faculty of a particular university, which in many ways shapes the kind of views that they instill in their students. So I don't think universities have by any means a uniformity of views in terms of the future of the American liberal order or America's place in the world. I think there are often many critical voices, voices that suggest alternatives. So I think there is a extraordinary element of diversity in American universities. That said, there are at least a half a dozen scholars, and at least 3 of them who are quite prominent who come to mind, who still believe and have written with considerable authority, arguing that, that there is this persistent myth of American decline and the United States remains a dominant power. I refer you to the work of Michael Beckley, who has written with great authority on this subject and teaches at Tufts University, who has an entire book arguing that all this talk about American decline is simply cyclical and really does not stand up to careful scrutiny. and that the US will remain the dominant power in the international system for the foreseeable future. You look at the work of Bill Wolfert's work at Dartmouth, who wrote an entire book at the end of the Cold War and pretty much stands by the argument, World Out of Balance, where he talks about American dominance and the elements of American dominance. And then you have I recently was on a panel at an MIT conference with Keir Lieber, who made a spirited argument about continued American dominance and the likelihood thereof for the foreseeable future, and basically was quite dismissive. And I don't think I'm being in any way giving you a jaundiced view of what Keir presented. I think I'm quite accurately reflecting what he presented, and he had an array of statistics at his command, which showed how, despite relative decline, the US remained the dominant power, and unless it made particularly foolish or counterproductive choices, it was likely to remain that way in the foreseeable future. And also the academic discourse of the declinists in large measure has in itself declined in the recent past. So let it rest at that.
Hey, thanks, Sumit. And I'll just add one sentence. American academia may be diminishing in influence, but the Confucius Institutes are growing around America, and that's another kind of influence. But Toshi-san, please.
Yeah, I've spent some years at American think tanks like the Brookings Institution and the Wilson Center. And I know, how vibrant the discussion is at those institutions. And the new competition that we're observing is not just about sheer power or raw power, right? It's about ideas and it's about soft power. And if you want to engage in a serious, open, liberal discussion without being punished, Washington, these think tanks are the place to go. And I think they're very strong. I think that's one of the most strongest power that America has. But at the same time, Professor Gupta, you mentioned about the middle-class foreign policy, that there's a sort of a think tank bubble in Washington, and that they're not adapting to the societal changes that America is facing. So I guess they're, the American think tanks, the Washington policy institution does have to realize these changes. And I think it totally makes sense that Biden foreign policy team is aware of that. Many see, this idea of middle-class foreign policy critically, that they're trying to use foreign policy to achieve economic goals. But then again, foreign policy starts at home. And I think it totally makes, and this is a difficult, an adaptation process. But I think it's the process that America has to go through. And I think it makes a total sense.
Okay. Thank you so much. Glenn, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, well, I worked mostly for universities. Not so much think tanks, but still the universities also have some impact on actual policies. At least my university in Moscow, because the head of my department there is an advisor to the president. Also, an advisor on this Greater Eurasian initiative. So the work you do there that does go forward in terms of shaping how, for example, Russia or in partnership with other countries can learn to develop their own technological platforms, their own alternative transportation corridors and new financial instruments, but also in terms of students, because at least there are students, we made sure that we have programs there where they can, in the past they would learn, German or French, but now, learning Chinese, Korean, Japanese, some of the Eastern languages, as Russia is trying to position itself more within the Eurasian framework instead of having this excessive focus on the West. But again, not so much within the think tanks.
I just wanted to tell you, Norway is gaining great soft power in the United States, because first we saw Lillehammer, now we're watching Atlantic Crossing. Though I still can't understand how you could not find a Norwegian actress to play the Crown Princess, and you found a Swede. But that's okay. That's just mild criticism. Ariel, go ahead.
Thank you. I consider myself in between the academic world and the think tank world. I actually run the academic think tank of my university. And in my discussions and interactions with American experts and of think tanks, I think that they play a very important role that is related to the deficit analysis on our region. So generally in the Washington circles, a region or a country is important when there are a lot of problems. So it's difficult to advance an agenda based on soft issues of soft agenda, like climate change, like economic considerations, finance. That is mostly the concerns especially in southern corner of Latin America. And on the other hand, I think building on the arguments of Dr. Goswami and Amit, there is an increasing influence of the Latino minorities in the think tanks related to Latin American issues. So I think this is something that is going on and is quite interesting because on one hand, there is more regional voices in DC and in all the US, but at the same time, the agenda is very concentrated on the more geographical priorities of the US, like Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, and is very related to security affairs, like counter narco traffics, organized crime, etc. So I think that this is our trend that are going on, but I think Latin America is getting more attention. I think this administration is showing something that was at least very impressive compared to other administrations, and even more compared with Trump, that was actually obsessed only with Venezuela and with Cuba.
Okay, thank you, Ariel. We have a second question, and it's for all of you. And I think that'll take us to the end of the session. And it's a good question. Though he's written about 14 lines, but I'll summarize it in one sentence. He says, how do we bring about, or how can we accept a positive sum rise of China? In other words, from your different perspectives, a China which is a major world power, but it is acceptable to the United States, to Argentina, to Norway, to Russia, to Japan. And, you know, I think this becomes a very interesting discussion. So please, whoever wants to take first crack at this, go ahead.
I'll take a crack at it.
Please.
And I'll speak from the US standpoint. I cannot visualize, at least in the foreseeable future, how one could have a positive sum relationship with the People's Republic of China. Because regardless of your political persuasion, whether you happen to be an independent, a Democrat, or a Republican, it is exceedingly difficult to envisage a time, at least under the present circumstances. And I am mindful of what George Orwell once said, that intellectuals have a tendency to eternalize the present. And I am quite cognizant of that warning. But despite that warning, it is extremely difficult to see, given the vision that the PRC under Xi Jinping has for world order, that it is fundamentally inimical to American interests and is likely to remain so. There was a school of thought in the United States, primarily people who believed in notions of liberal interdependence, who argued quite forcefully and sought to influence American policy, and particularly under Obama's first administration before he got mugged in Beijing, not literally, but figuratively, that you could enmesh the PRC in a set of institution, norms, and ideas, and thereby socialize its behavior and change it to accept certain American-led norms, principles, and institutions. Well, that worked out really well. I never subscribed to that, being an unabashed realist, and remained so. And anyone who continues to put faith in this notion is living, frankly, in a chimera.
Thank you, Sumit. Toshi-san,
Can I?
and then Paul.
Well, thank you. I almost totally agree with what Professor Ganguly said right now, that this notion that this, China and US would converge, right? This notion of positive sum theory, that this is a fantasy, is that I think the reason why people came at this notion is that this presupposing that this positive sum is possible may even be dangerous. Right? So we should be focusing on the power aspect of it. I think it all depends on how China decides to rise. But at the moment, if you add up what China is trying to do, it gives a strong impression that they're trying to build a China-centric order in our region. And because of the geographical proximity, Japan is clearly aware of that. Not just Japan, but many other countries, which many in Southeast Asia, Korea as well, but they see, China's rise and decides that, there's no other option to sort of adapt to it. In Japan, Australia, and India, to a certain degree, is all the countries that are saying that this China's hegemonic ambition, which is centered on China-centric order, is not desirable for this region. It's not that we're against China's rise per se. It's this vision that China has disturbs us, and it will be a very negative for our region. That's how I see it. So the simple answer is that I don't see a positive sum game at this one.
Okay. Well, I just want to take one more minute of Toshi's time, if that is okay, because I want to ask you the question which everybody raises in the United States. Given Japanese demographic decline, how do you think you will be able to deter the Chinese, one? And two, I've been going to American Political Science Association meetings, about which the less said, the better. It's complete waste of time. Yes, Sumit knows exactly what I'm saying. And I prefer the Popular Culture Association. But second thing is, I actually heard a paper which claimed that Japanese attitudes on nuclearization are changing, which I would like to hear what you have to say.
Well, on the second point, yes, there is a change. At least we've started talking about the issue, but it's really far from Japan going nuclear. So, I think it's totally rational to have a discussion whether Japan should go nuclear or not. And that kind of conversation is going on among the experts. It's not a national dialogue. But I would say it's far away from us going nuclear, because we understand the implications. We would lose the rationale to convince the North Koreans that they have to denuclearize. I'm sure the Koreans would not be happy with it. Even Taiwan would not be happy with it. So, you can count that out, actually Japan going nuclear. And on the first point, we cannot, clearly China's rise is the biggest issue that we're facing. But we cannot sort of cope with this situation at all. And the best option and the best choice we have is the US-Japan alliance plus, right? Australia, India. And it's not like confronting China and getting ready to fight with China, but it's more about upholding the liberal international order that we cherish and complicating China's action, when it, at a point when it's not desirable. Right? So it's not like, getting ready to fight, but more it's about surrounding China with the desirable norms and rules and order. And we're willing to do this with US, Australia, everybody who's willing to come on board. So that's how we're trying to cope with China's rise.
Thank you. Paul, I'm sorry, good. And then Namrata.
Not at all, not at all. So being myself very much also a foreign policy realist, I think I broadly agree with much of what's already been said. I'll just try to kind of tick off 4 points here very quickly in terms of why I think it is at this point practically impossible for the United States to take a positive sum approach to China. First, I think there's a very widespread view in the United States among both elites and people in general that we tried that and it failed. We tried that for 20 years after the end of the Cold War. China systematically took advantage of the United States on intellectual property, on trade, investment, on a whole host of other issues. It cost the American economy hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's too late for positive sum. Second, I think that's an approach that's much easier to take when the United States is quite powerful and China isn't. It's a much more challenging approach to take intellectually, politically, and otherwise as the two countries become closer and closer to one another, however one chooses to measure power. Third, without kind of spending too much time on China's behavior, I'll just focus on one thing that's happening right now, Hong Kong. I think for the American political class, what's happening in Hong Kong is basically viewed as a trial run for what China wants to do to Taiwan if it doesn't just invade Taiwan outright. And I'm not personally taking a position here on how likely I think that is or isn't, but I think from the perspective of the American political class, that's reached a level of anxiety around that issue that I have not really seen before. And then finally, just referring back to Toshi Nakayama, who just spoke. The United States is, the US government, experts at think tanks, reporters, members of Congress are constantly hearing from America's allies and partners in the region about their own anxieties about China, about what they want the United States to do about China. And there's a spectrum there, obviously, and some might prefer a more confrontational approach, and others might prefer a less confrontational approach. Certainly, South Korea, has a different perspective from Japan, you know, to point to one. But I think it's become very apparent, you know, to American policymakers that there's a real demand for this. And you know, again, as a realist, I would say there's kind of an intellectual difference between the existence of demand and what's a good idea for American foreign policy. Those are two separate issues in my mind. But if we think about the realities of the situation that the United States is in, it's just a constant stream of concern coming out of the region. Thank you.
No, thank you. Namrata.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Gupta. So I think the question that Keio asked is very interesting. So the question is, can we conceptualize the rise of China from a positive sum perspective? And what I find interesting in the question is that his argument is that how it seems to be a better conceptualization for a small state like Nepal to basically have a systemic level conceptualization where it's not us versus them, but it's actually more engagement. Now, if that is the starting point, I would say that it is not the rise of China, as Mr. Nakayama mentioned, that is a problem. I think if you look at the factual evidence, especially when it comes to small states, for example, Bhutan, and I study China-Bhutan relationship, you would see that there has been a tendency on the behalf of China to basically negate the Bhutanese view when it comes to disputes, for example, their border dispute. So the Bhutanese Foreign Affairs Ministry pointed out that the dispute in the Doklam area shouldn't have been disputed at all because there were understandings between them that they would resolve this dispute peacefully and would not engage any kind of physical changes to the landscape. But contrary to that understanding, China's foreign ministry pointed out that that particular understanding with Bhutan did not include Doklam because Doklam has always been Chinese territory. So the point I'm making here is that when you think about the rise of China at the systemic level, and that includes how China has engaged with small states, for example, the states that dispute China's unilateral claim of the South China Sea Islands, you can see that China has tended to be a bit of a bully because it has basically unilaterally established islands in the South China Sea. It has negated the perspectives of the countries that dispute with it, primarily because they are weaker countries vis-a-vis China from a relative perspective. I'll finally end by saying that if you look at the rise of China and why I agree with Professor Ganguly and others that you might not be able to see it from a positive sum, and Dr. Gupta, you mentioned the influence of Confucius Institutes rising, which is the soft power influence as well. But what does it actually mean from a strategic and future perspective? It means that you would have a world order where you have a country that is basically determined to be against any kind of democratic representation, diversity of perspectives, which we talk about so much, inclusivity. You can see that behavior when it comes to China's engagement with Hong Kong as well. And so at a systemic level, I do not think we can actually locate China and the US in a positive sum because there are fundamental differences in terms of their ideology, political culture, and strategic culture. And China under President Xi Jinping is basically articulating a vision for the future that is based on, and this I mention all the time when I basically try to showcase that his perspective is that the China under President Xi Jinping is a China that is led by the Communist Party of China. It's a one-party system where leaderships are basically for life, including his own presidential stint. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we talk about positive sum engagement.
Okay, thank you. Ariel, Glenn, please.
Thank you. So yeah, I largely agree with a lot of what's been said. I think especially in terms of relations between the United States and China, I think it's going to be very hard to have a positive sum relationship. Also in general, when you have historically, when there's a huge concentration of economic power, you have the ability to create this liberal economic system with clear international division of labor. I think as there's more competition for economic leadership between the Americans and Chinese, there will be more and more rivalry, and as they all seek to repatriate their supply chains and make themselves less vulnerable, there's going to be less area of common interest and cooperation, and more zero-sum rivalry. However, when it comes to other countries, I don't necessarily think that, I think there's more opportunity for positive sum gain, simply because China can be more accommodating if it pursues this first among equal rather than dominance. Now, because I don't think China can realistically pursue a strategy of dominance or hegemony or global hegemony, because even if its economy surpasses the United States, it's still going to be defined by a bipolar or multipolar system. That is, it can't dominate the way the US dominated after the Cold War. I don't think any country can reclaim that position. And that's quite a different, and that makes a huge difference. Especially, again, for Russia, because for Russia, the relationship with the US has been almost completely zero-sum game, because simply put, there was no room for any political subjectivity for Russia in the unipolar era. So under a US security strategy based on global dominance, it simply didn't have any ability to accommodate it in Europe, and all relations have been formed along this zero-sum line. So for example, if you look at Russia's neighbors, whenever not just the US but West in general engages with anyone from Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, or Central Asia, the objective is always to peel away Russia's neighbor from Russia. And even Turkey, China, every partner Russia has is seen as problematic, something to split up. So everything becomes in this zero-sum format simply because it could not be accommodated within the unipolar order. So and Russia doesn't have this problem with China. And again, in Central Asia, the biggest lesson was when the Chinese goes in, yes, they displace Russian influence. However, their objective isn't to marginalize Russia. So instead, they make efforts to harmonize interest and make sure not to step on the Russians' toes, simply because if you have the Russians go against you, they can make life very unpleasant for China in that region. So what they experience now with China is what they never had from the West, which is this willingness to harmonize interest and make compromises. So, but again, it all depends how China rises, as was said earlier. If it's happy to have this role as a first among equal, in other words, to be a leader but not dominate, then I think there's a lot of scope there to continue, at least the Russian-Chinese partnership, because Russia doesn't really have any ambition or capabilities to pursue hegemony. So to be the junior partner, it's not such a bad deal for Russia, as long as that larger partner doesn't try to cut it out, marginalize, topple its government, bomb its allies. This is a pretty sweet deal. So it's I think it has more potential there in terms of positive sum gain. To some extent, but less so also with the Europeans. Again, the need for China to develop an independent foreign policy, to pursue strategic autonomy. It can also, to some extent, serve as a positive sum game. Again, it all depends how China plays its card. If it's willing to be the first among equal instead of taking this dominant strategy, then I think there's room for optimism. But again, with the US and China, I think not so much. That rivalry for competition, again, also being a realist, I don't see how any positive sum.
Let me just ask you a quick follow-on question, and this will take a second. This is Chinese investment in the European Union, so Norway is not in it. And from 2000 to 2019. And if you look at that, the bulk of it is in Western Europe. It's not low-hanging fruit in Eastern Europe. How do you think that's going to change? Or do you think that the logic now is that despite everything that's happening in the US-China relationship, the Europeans will take more money in? And the comprehensive agreement on investment might finally get passed out of the European Parliament.
Well, I guess the general assumption would be that as China's economic footprint continues to grow in Europe, it will increasingly translate into political loyalties. Again, I'm not saying countries like Germany will choose China over US, not at all. But the unwillingness to follow the US lead, I think, as the economic growth there, obviously there's more investments being done in Western Europe, but they also have stronger ties with the US. But if you look in Eastern Europe, there's less investments, but you still see more willingness than to, start, for example, like Hungary, to go against both the EU and the US in terms of joining any anti-Chinese initiatives. But even with Germany, they came out very strong now, saying they will not partake in any Cold War against China. Also, they would like to repair or get along better with Russia, so end this zero-sum structures that we never fixed after the Cold War. So start to deal with some of these issues. So a lot of this will be a reflection of economics, as the your map showed, as the investments continue to go up. Economic interests are increasingly every year by year, shifting more and more relatively from intra-Europe and also towards the US and more towards the East. And as that happens, I think it's reasonable to expect that some of the political loyalties will change. And I think that's also why the US is having much greater challenge now to convert this security dependence of the Europeans into geo-economic loyalties, which is why the Europeans increasingly are willing to defy the US to buy the Chinese technologies, buy the Russian energy, and even in the, with the threat of sanctions.
Thank you, Glenn. Ariel.
As Professor Nakayama told us, geography matters. So as a realist too, I think Latin America is very far from China in terms of the intensity of their strategic interests. Nonetheless, if the narrative in Washington about the competence among great powers and the wolf diplomacy of Beijing continues, I think we will continue to see some worrying steps of China in the region, in which, for example, step up some investments or some initiatives that can create concerns in the United States. For example, years ago, China put space station base in Argentina, and it was based on an agreement between the Argentina and Chinese governments. So after that, the US South Command, the Pentagon, like every year, say some formal or informal statements about it. And in the last few months, there was some concerns that the Chinese were thinking to invest in a naval base in the southern city of Ushuaia, is the port to Antarctica. So rising concerns from the director, the chairman of the USS Command in a visit to Buenos Aires. So I think there are some elements that show us that if this strategic competence continue, well, despite the geographical distances, there will be some like small but important battles in Latin America.
Okay, thank you. We have 10 minutes left. Does anybody have anything they want to add? Okay, I'll just say this. I think, the more I look at weapons technology, the less I'm impressed by it. But I think the real battle between the United States and China is 5G, artificial intelligence, robotics. And the time has come for the United States to really think in terms of a global information order, which brings the Europeans in, which brings the Indians in, which brings the Latin Americans in, which brings large chunks of the world in to compete with the Chinese. Because, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was right. He who controls 5G will control the world. And, I keep saying this, stop talking about militarizing the Quad. It's a waste of time. The Australians won't fight. The Indians will, the Japanese Navy says this, Toshi-san, they say India is too far away. They're being absolutely pragmatic saying it. They're not being, critical. But can you guys imagine what would happen if a American, European, Indian 5G network emerged with 2 billion people in it? That's the end of the 5G game. Huawei is shut out. And then you have exactly what Toshi-san has talked about, and some of you've talked about. You are building a liberal international order based on technology. And it's sort of addressing Glenn's issue about how do we build geoeconomics. So that is that. I think we've more or less discussed everything. Thank you so much for doing this, everybody. I know for some of you, it's rather late. I was up at 4:15 in the morning, so I don't believe there's enough coffee to keep me awake after this. But thanks again. Thank you, Sumit. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Toshi-san. And of course, last but not least, thank you, Namrata.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
All right, we'll all leave.
Yes, sir. So at the end of the session, we have a vote of thanks to all the speakers and the chair. So here is the vote of the thanks.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express our sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.
So thank you, everyone. And it was an insightful session. So hope to see you again, all of you. So this much for today and have a good time ahead. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.